For almost 300 years, the Mughal Empire was an absolute powerhouse on the world stage. I mean, we're talking a beacon of incredible wealth, culture, and military strength. And yet, in just 150 years, it all just fell apart. So today, we're digging into the story of how this superpower completely unraveled.
It's a question that really gets you thinking, right? How does one of the richest empires in the world, an empire that controlled a quarter of the global economy and gave us wonders like the Taj Mahal, how does it just disappear? Well, the answer isn't some big single event. Nope, it was more like a cascade of failures, a slow burn that started deep within the empire itself.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the fall, we first have to understand the peak. Let's go back to 1707. The Mughal Empire under Emperor Aurangzeb is an absolute titan. It stretches across pretty much the entire Indian subcontinent. The government is running smoothly, the army is a force to be reckoned with, and the treasury, it was legendary. Seriously, from the outside, this thing looked completely invincible. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Even at its absolute zenith, the seeds of its own destruction were already being planted. You see, Aurangzeb's long reign was kind of a paradox. His constant push to expand into the south was costing a fortune, literally draining the treasury. And by spending more than 25 years down there, he left the super important northwest border wide open and vulnerable. On top of that, he reversed the empire's long-standing policy of religious tolerance, which really ticked off a lot of his Hindu subjects and rulers. The first tiny cracks were starting to show.
All right, so you've got these cracks forming in the foundation. And then the first big domino falls. The moment Aurangzeb dies in 1707, the empire is thrown into a massive leadership crisis. And honestly, the only way to describe it is a real-life Game of Thrones.
You see, unlike the long, steady reigns of the earlier emperors, the period after Aurangzeb was just chaos. The Mughals didn't have a clear next-in-line rule, so every time an emperor died, it was basically a free-for-all among his sons. And the result? Just look at this timeline. It was a total mess. In just over 40 years, you have 6 different emperors on the throne. I mean, 2 of them came and went in the single year of 1719. This constant turmoil basically paralyzed the entire state.
And all this chaos? It created a huge power vacuum. And who steps in? Powerful, super ambitious nobles. The game totally changed. Instead of princes fighting for the throne, you now have these nobles fighting each other, using the royal princes like pawns on a chessboard. Guys like Zulfikar Khan and the famous Syed brothers became known as the kingmakers. They'd literally put an emperor on the throne, and then just as easily they'd get rid of him, sometimes permanently, if he stopped being useful to them.
And the speed of this decay was just stunning. I mean, take a look at this chart. While the emperors who came after Aurangzeb did try to undo his harsh religious policies, the core of the empire was just crumbling away. With every new ruler, the administration got weaker and the finances got worse. The whole machine of the empire was just grinding to a halt.
Now, this political rot at the top wasn't just some drama happening in the palace. Oh no, it had absolutely devastating consequences for the empire's entire economic engine. The state wasn't just being badly managed, it was literally going broke from the inside out.
To really get why this was happening, we need to talk about a core piece of the Mughal system, something called a jagir. The whole empire basically ran on this. So think of it like this. Instead of getting paid a cash salary, a high-ranking official would be given a jagir. That's a temporary right to collect all the taxes and revenue from a piece of land. This was their income, and it was supposed to keep them loyal and pay for their soldiers. But that very system started to break down, and it set off this terrible chain reaction. Here's how it went. Step 1. The emperors kept creating more and more nobles to reward them for fighting in all these wars. Step 2. Pretty soon there wasn't enough good land or jagirs to give to all of them. So what happens? Step 3. The nobles who did have land knew they might lose it at any time, so they squeezed the peasants for every last drop of cash. And finally, Step 4. The military, which was funded by this whole system, got weaker and weaker because the nobles were cutting corners to keep more money for themselves. It was a total downward spiral.
And this, of course, spiraled into a massive crisis in the countryside, an agrarian crisis. The whole system basically encouraged short-term greed. There was zero incentive for anyone to invest in the land for the long haul. So what did the oppressed peasants do? Well, they either packed up and left, or more and more, they started to fight back. These huge uprisings by groups like the Jats, the Sikhs, and the Satnamis, they weren't just random riots. They were a direct symptom of a system that was completely broken from the ground up.
So by the 1730s, the situation is absolutely dire.
Yeah, the Mughal Empire still had an emperor sitting in Delhi, and it still had a fancy court, but it was all just a hollow shell. The political chaos, the empty treasury, and the collapsing administration had turned this once mighty empire into a house of cards, just waiting for a breeze to knock it over.
And that's exactly when the external shocks began. You know, a weakened empire is like blood in the water for its enemies, and powerful rivals were watching from the northwest, that very same frontier that Aurangzeb had ignored for decades.
The first, and maybe most devastating blow, came from the ruler of Persia, Nadir Shah. In 1739, he just swept into India, completely crushed the weak Mughal army, and subjected the capital, Delhi, to a horrific sack. I mean, he didn't just steal money, he ripped the heart out of the empire. He took its prestige, its wealth, and its most legendary treasures, like the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The empire psychologically and financially never, ever recovered from this.
And it didn't stop there. After Nader Shah, the next big threat was the Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Abdali. Just look at this. Over the course of almost 20 years, he launched 8 separate invasions. These weren't really about conquering the land. They were just massive, brutal raiding parties designed to plunder and bleed North India dry. It just kept the whole region in a state of constant chaos.
So after all these catastrophic invasions, the game was up. The pretense was over. The Mughal Empire, which had once ruled an entire subcontinent, was now, for all practical purposes, just the Kingdom of Delhi. Its power barely reached beyond the city walls. And that brings us to the final act. The last century of the empire is really this slow, painful story of its descent from a ruler in name only to basically a powerless pensioner, living in the shadow of new powers that were rising all around it. This really was the long goodbye. It was just a slow, kind of heartbreaking decline. First, the emperor becomes a pawn of the Marathas. Then, in 1803, the British come in and take the emperor under their protection, basically making him their pensioner. The final insult comes in 1835, when the East India Company stops even putting the emperor's name on their coins. The Great Revolt of 1857 was one last desperate gasp for relevance, but it failed, and it ended with the last emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, being exiled to Burma, where he died, a lonely prisoner. I mean, just stop and think about the sheer scale of this story. Look at these two bookends. It all started in 1526 with Babur, a descendant of legendary world conquerors who forged this incredible empire. And it ends 336 years later with his direct descendant dying in exile, a prisoner of a foreign trading company. The rise and the fall, it's just staggering to think about. But here's a really important point. The end of the empire wasn't the end of its influence, not by a long shot. Its legacy was profound. The systems of government, the incredible culture, the art, the traditions, all the things the Mughals had developed, they didn't just vanish. They were picked up, adopted, and adapted by all the new regional states that popped up, and even by the British who ultimately took over.
And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to chew on. Some historians have argued that the empire didn't collapse because it failed, but because it succeeded. The idea is that the system created a class of nobles and landowners that became so wealthy and powerful that they were eventually strong enough to just break away and do their own thing. So if a system's own success can lead to its great unraveling, what does that teach us about power and stability today?